Berlin, 1937. Albert Speer is standing in front of a model, a giant dome, 290 meters tall, bigger than St. Peter's Basilica, bigger than anything humanity had ever built. A hall for 180,000 people. The capital of the world, Germania. Speer is 32, an architect, educated, cultured, the kind of man who listens to Beethoven while sketching buildings. And here he stands, in front of this model, and the only thing he feels is awe. Pure, professional, almost childlike awe, because the man who commissioned this project, the man watching him from across the room right now, gave him something no client in the world could offer: an unlimited budget, unlimited power, and the feeling that you're building eternity. That man is Adolf Hitler. And Speer would later say something at the Nuremberg trials, a sentence more important than any verdict. If Hitler had a friend, I would have been that friend. Not a soldier, not a fanatic, a friend. How does this work? How does a normal, educated, fundamentally decent person become the right hand of a monster? And here you want to say, well, that was 1930s Germany, a special case. But it's not a special case, it's a pattern. History rarely begins with a tyrant. It begins with exhaustion. Every time a dangerous leader rises to power, the people standing beside him aren't demons. They're engineers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, people who kiss their children in the morning and sign documents in the evening, documents that ensure other children won't live to see the morning. Rwanda, 1994. The genocide lasts 100 days, 800,000 dead. And the killers aren't professional soldiers, they're neighbors, people who were borrowing sugar from each other just yesterday. But let's look at what came before, what was happening in these societies 5, 10 years before the catastrophe. Germany in the 20s, hyperinflation, people hauling cash in wheelbarrows to buy bread, the humiliation of Versailles, unemployment that knocks out any sense of control. Rwanda, decades of colonial division, artificially inflated enmity, economic crisis. The same pattern every time: fear, chaos, the feeling that the world is falling apart. And in that moment, someone appears and says, I know why you're suffering, and I know what to do. And normal people, not stupid, not evil, start listening. Not because they agree with everything he says, but because he gives them something they didn't have: certainty. Now, the most important part: how exactly this happens. Not why people are bad, but the specific mechanics that turn a normal person into an accomplice. First mechanism, the staircase. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to serve evil. Evil rarely begins with evil. It begins with a reasonable opportunity. It's always a staircase. Each next step is just slightly further than the last, but each one on its own is perfectly explainable. Speer didn't come to Hitler and say, I want to participate in crimes against humanity. He attended a lecture as a student. The lecture impressed him. Then he was invited to design the staging for a party rally, then to renovate a building, then to design a stadium. And then he was already Minister of Armaments, and concentration camp prisoners were working in his factories. At every step, he had a choice. But at every step, the cost of walking away grew. First you lose an interesting project, then a career, then your standing, then your freedom. And then you're already so far gone that the only way to live with yourself is to convince yourself that all of this means something. And at every step, the circle tightens. First, jokes about outsiders, then labels, then laws. And then you no longer notice that you've stopped seeing another human being as human. The staircase doesn't just take you deeper into the system, it narrows what you're willing to see. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram demonstrated this in a lab in 1961. Ordinary people, mailmen, clerks, teachers, delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers, not because they were cruel, but because a man in a white coat said, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue." And they continued. 65% went all the way to the maximum. Milgram later said something deeply unsettling. He said, "The problem isn't that people are cruel. The problem is that people are obedient." Second mechanism, the transfer of responsibility. When there's an authority above you, something strange happens. You stop feeling like the author of your own actions. You're an instrument. You carry out. Someone else made the decision. This isn't a lie. It's not an excuse. It's a real psychological shift. A person literally experiences their own actions differently when acting under orders. The brain processes it as someone else's action, performed by your hands. Hannah Arendt observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, the trains, the schedules, the routes. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she saw a bureaucrat, a man who spoke in officialese, cited orders, and seemed genuinely unable to understand what he was guilty of. He was just doing his job. Arendt called it the banality of evil. And that phrase became perhaps the most important diagnosis of the 20th century. Third mechanism, confidence disguised as competence. There is an old and well-documented psychological effect. A person who speaks with confidence is automatically perceived as more competent, even when they're wrong. We don't evaluate arguments, we evaluate tone. A person who says, "I think, perhaps," seems weak. A person who says, "This is the only solution," seems strong. And the brain makes a short circuit. Strength equals intelligence. Dangerous leaders never say, "The situation is complicated." They say, "It's very simple." And in times of anxiety, when people are desperate for someone who seems to know the way, simplicity sounds like truth, not because it's accurate, but because it's clear. And this is what makes the dangerous leader so hard to spot in real time. He doesn't look dangerous, he looks certain. And certainty, in a frightened society, feels like rescue. Fourth mechanism, the meaning trap. And this might be the most subtle of all. A dangerous leader doesn't just give orders, he gives meaning. He says, "You are part of a great project. You are building a new world. Your life is not a meaningless string of days. You are a soldier of history." And this is incredibly attractive, especially for people who feel the world doesn't value them, that their life is passing by for nothing, that everything is pointless. Speer said it directly. Hitler gave him purpose, scale, the feeling that he was doing something historic. And here's the question, how easy is it to walk away from the only source of meaning in your life, even when that meaning is poisoned? 2016, Elizabeth Holmes stand on a stage, black turtleneck, deep voice, steady gaze. She says Theranos will change medicine, 1 drop of blood, 200 tests, a revolution. Hundreds of people work for her, Stanford engineers, biochemists, developers, and they know the technology doesn't work. Inside the company, it's an open secret. Tests give wrong results. Data is being falsified. Patients are getting false diagnoses. But people keep working. Because leaving is terrifying. Because Holmes built a culture where doubt is betrayal. where the question, "Are we sure this works?" means you don't believe in the mission, that you're weak, that you're not one of us. There were people who left. There were people who tried to speak up. They were fired. They were threatened with lawsuits. One young employee who raised the alarm came under such pressure that he took his own life. And notice the structure. A leader with narcissistic charisma. A big idea that's bigger than any individual. A system that punishes doubt and rewards loyalty. Gradual escalation, transfer of responsibility. She makes the decisions, we're just doing our part. The meaning trap, we're changing the world. Nobody died in gas chambers. The scale is incomparable, but the mechanics are the same, down to the last bolt. And here's what's truly disturbing. If this works in Silicon Valley in the 21st century, among people with degrees from the world's best universities, it can work anywhere. And here's where we tend to think a certain way. We assume the problem is the leader, that there's an evil person deceiving good people, and if it weren't for him, everything would be different. But that's not how it works. The problem wasn't that Hitler was persuasive. The problem was that millions of people wanted to be persuaded. The problem wasn't that Holmes lied. The problem was that people needed the story to be true. The problem was never the strength of the tyrant. The problem was the need he filled. The need for certainty, for belonging, for meaning, for the feeling that some adult is in control of the situation. A dangerous leader is not a cause, he is a symptom. He appears where there's already a wound. He doesn't create fear, he exploits it. He doesn't create the void, he fills it. And fighting the leader without addressing the wound is like bringing down a fever without treating the infection. Speer served 20 years in Spandau, got out, wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, and until the end of his life, he kept repeating that he hadn't known the full scale of the Holocaust. Historians debate whether he was lying. But there's a third possibility, and it's more frightening than either answer. Maybe he truly didn't know because he didn't want to know. Because there is a particular kind of ignorance that takes effort. You don't close your eyes, you simply stop looking in that direction. You don't lie to yourself. You simply never ask the question whose answer would destroy everything you've built. The most dangerous ignorance isn't when people close their eyes. It's when they simply stop looking in that direction.